It's really good to be with you again. Happy Sunday, everybody, and it's good to see you all. And the sermon on building the beloved community was actually suggested by Chris way back this past spring, and then we had this global pandemic or something that got in the way of doing this sermon. Because certainly on some level, talking about community while we're separated physically was an interesting challenge to think about. I also think there's real power in understanding the beloved community as something bigger than an individual community, like a community. It's the beloved community. It's larger than that. It's something that's expansive and includes all of us. It's a grand, beautiful, and even theological concept of inclusion. Our opening words for the sermon today come from Martin Luther King Jr. And I do, before I jump into that, I do want to just acknowledge Tony was good to remind us earlier before the service started about John Lewis's passing. So I think it's good to remember him today. And also it's part of this sermon because certainly the beloved community was deeply connected to the work that he deeply fought for. So our opening words today do come from Martin Luther King Jr., and they were spoken in 1956 following the announcement of a U.S. Supreme Court decision which desegregated the seats on Montgomery's buses. And he spoke, "The end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform oppressors into friends. It is this type of understanding, goodwill, that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of people." Josiah Royce, who's a professor of philosophy, or was, he's long passed, but he was at Harvard, and he was also the founder of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He was the first that we know of that spoke or used the phrase the beloved community in the early 20th century. In a book he wrote called The Problem of Christianity, Royce wrote, "Since the office of religion is to aim towards the creation on earth of the beloved community, the future task of religion is the task of inventing and applying arts which shall win all over to unity, and which shall overcome their original hatefulness by the gracious love, not of mere individuality, but of communities. Judge every social device, every proposed reform, every national and every local enterprise by the one test. Does this help towards the coming of the universal community?" Now, inspired by Royce, many of our religious forebears began to use the phrase the beloved community. So we actually, in our movement, it was a phrase that was part of our movement before MLK popularized it. For example, Unitarian John Haynes Holmes named his congregation by the term, which we now know as the Community Church of New York. And that was actually that whole community church movement was inspired by the concept of the beloved community. And Universalist Clarence Skinner wrote, "The beloved community is not an organization of individuals seeking private and selfish security for their souls. It is a new adventure, a spontaneous fellowship of consecrated people seeking a new world." Lots of future thinking, lots of looking off into what's possible, what could come, what's on the horizon. But as I mentioned, the phrase didn't really truly become well known until Martin Luther King Jr. popularized the term, capturing the imagination of people all over the world with its use. And he used it many times throughout his life. The King Center, which was actually created to preserve MLK's legacy, described his use of the word like this. He said, Dr. King's beloved community is a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an inclusive spirit, all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. In the beloved community, international disputes will be resolved by peaceful conflict resolution and reconciliation of adversaries instead of military power. Love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred. Peace with justice will prevail over war and military conflict. Now, this practice of dreaming into the future, of dreaming what's possible, of a world that's could be, goes back probably as far as human consciousness. The Hebrew prophets such as Micah and Amos and Isaiah are some of our earliest known examples of this kind of dreaming into the future. And we often think of the Hebrew prophets as proclaimers of the end is near, and may perhaps think of them as a little bit crazy or mentally ill. But they actually weren't mentally ill at all, like shouting on a street corner kind of thing. What they were doing, we sometimes misunderstand them, but they were actually deeply brave souls who risked their lives to speak truth to power, declaring to the upper echelons of society that if you do not change your evil ways, destruction would be the result. They were actually, the end of near kind of associations we have with them was them saying, you're behaving really badly, and that's not going to come back at you if you don't change your ways. And Amos is one of the great examples of this. He said, woe to you who desire the day of the Lord. Why do you want the day of the Lord? It is darkness and not light, as if someone fled from a lion and was met by a bear, or went into the house and rested a hand against the wall and was bitten by a snake. Is not the day of the Lord darkness, not light, and gloom with no brightness in it? And again, he's speaking to wealthy, rich people, speaking to royalty, speaking to religious festivals and religious people who abuse their wealth. And he says, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings, I will not accept them, and the offerings of well-being of your fattened animals. I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your hearts. These are all symbols and acts of wealth in that society. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. But the prophets didn't just speak of doom and gloom and the end is near. They also often spoke of positive futures as well, what could occur. And one of the most famous is from Micah, when he declared, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. But they shall all sit under their own vines and their own fig trees, and no one shall make them afraid. One of the most beautiful, American uses of that phrase is actually, George Washington used it in his last speech when he was declaring that he was not going to run for president again, and it was gorgeously portrayed in Hamilton in a song in that musical. Now, Jesus, he sat in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets. He was a Hebrew prophet, and he spoke of the kingdom of heaven on earth as his means of calling forth what is possible. Jesus mentioned either the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven more than 80 times at least. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. The kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet cast in the sea. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. And his most famous use, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The beloved community that Martin Luther King and so many others have talked about is our modern example. It's our modern phrasing for the kingdom of heaven on earth. It is our dreaming into the future. It is our vision of an earth made fair with all her people one. But I think it's important to understand that I don't think there's any real way to see and understand this tradition of dreaming into the future, this calling forth of the beloved community, that I don't think we can understand this tradition without recognizing that this dreaming is the dreaming of people living under oppression, whether it's war or poverty or slavery or occupation or something else. This dreaming is occurring in the context of some form of oppression by people experiencing that oppression. And it's a speaking to this dreaming is a speaking to a state of injustice by people experiencing injustice in order to call forth a different possibility to hope for and to create within the space of our imagination a new option. And that brings us today to today and to racism in America is one topic where this really comes to bear. And there is a tradition within the Black community that I'm just starting to learn about, which I kind of find fascinating, which is called Afrofuturism. And it is literature, art, drama, music, all dreaming into the future of Black people. It's a whole kind of art form, many different forms of art about dreaming into the future, Black people dreaming into their own future. And it was first coined in 1994 by a man named Mark Derry, and he defined it as speculative fiction that treats African American themes and addresses African American concerns in the context of 20th century technoculture. That's the first kind of definition of Afrofuturism. And in 2010, Alondra Nelson, she described Afrofuturism as a way of looking at the subject position of Black people, which covers themes of alienation and aspiration for a utopic future. It's big words, but basically looking at the experience of alienation and the possibility for something better in the context of literature, science fiction, art, music, etc. Adrienne Marie Brown wrote an excellent book called Emergent Strategy, and I really encourage you to read it. It's fascinating. And she speaks of Afrofuturism in this way. What are we about to do after this winter of discontent? We say Black Lives Matter, an Afrofuturist assertion. Because we see something other than the normative truths of this place. We see something that is not there, not here. We see the future cast over this devastating present moment. We see and we believe, we know, and we bend the world to insert and embody that Black Lives Matter. And I just love that concept of thinking about Black Lives Matter as an Afrofuturism. That it's something we're trying to live into as a culture and a society, something that we do not live into currently, and that it's something we're dreaming about. We're dreaming about a world of Black lives mattering. Adrienne Marie Brown continues, and she's just really brilliant. So she offers these beautiful words to continue on Afrofuturism. And she says to focus on Afrofuturists in the Black social justice tradition. And as I say this, I will say that there's some really challenging words, phrases here. So just wanted to offer a little bit of a content warning because there's some tough subjects here around slavery, around sexual abuse, rape, and such. Not too much, but just a touch. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up on that. But she says that to focus on Afro-futurists in the Black social justice tradition, I would note that Africans leaping off of slave ships were Afro-futurists. Slave-era parents teaching their babies a foreign alphabet in the candlelight dirt were Afro-futurists. Black women dissociating themselves through to tomorrow while being raped into motherhood were Afro-futurists. Slaves who ran to freedom and slaves who ran to their death were Afro-futurists. It is the emphasis on a tomorrow, particularly in the face of extinction, that marks for me the Afro-futurist. It is the emphasis on a tomorrow, particularly in the face of extinction, that marks for me the Afro-futurist. She says, now it is our work, our Afro-futurisms, developing enough of a concrete dream language that we can be that much more explicit about the real futures we are shaping into existence. We are touching the future, reaching out across boundaries and post-apocalyptic conditions to touch each other, to call each other out as family, as beloveds, the beloved community, as beloveds. She dreams the details. We are creating a world we have never seen. We are whispering it to each other, cuddled in the dark, and we are screaming it at people who are so scared of it that they dress themselves in war regalia to turn and face us. Because of our ancestors, because of us, and because of the children we are raising, there will be a future without police and prisons, yes. There will be a future without rape, without harassment and constant fear and childhood sexual assault. A future without war, hunger, violence, with abundance, where gender is a joyful spectrum, where each of our bodies is treated like sacred ground, whether we have insurance or not. Because of her, I love this, because of our ancestors, because of us, and because of the children we are raising, there will be a future. She finishes, imagination is one of the spoils of colonization, which in many ways is claiming who gets to imagine the future, reclaiming the right to dream the future, strengthening the muscle to imagine together as Black people is a revolutionary decolonizing activity. Just really powerful, thinking about that, dreaming into the future and what is possible and what can be. And so as we think about all of these things, this returns then back to us, and it returns back to our own imaginations, our own capacity to dream a future. And so I invite you to ask that very question, what do you dream? You know, what is the beloved community? How do you access it here and now, right now, in your very own lives? How do you access the beloved community? How do you instill it, create it in your very own lives? And how do you draw that dream nearer to reality? And I'll also say, how do we listen to other dreams, to the dreams of those who have been disenfranchised in our society? How do we recenter those voices in our collective dream of the beloved community? Shalom, amen, and blessed be.